April 2016. The sky was clear over the Atlantic. An E-2C Hawkeye thundered toward USS Eisenhower on final approach. It was routine, the kind of landing Navy pilots perform through muscle memory. Line up with the glowing guide light, follow the hand signals of the landing officer on deck, lower the tailhook, and aim to catch one of the 4 thick steel cables stretched across the flight deck. Hook the cable, and the aircraft goes from 150 miles per hour to 0 in under 2 seconds. Brutal. Controlled. Perfect. But not this time. The tailhook hit the cable, but there was no jolt, no deceleration. Just a snap, loud and wrong. On deck, people screamed. One sailor turned, just in time to see a massive steel cable whipping toward him. Leap of faith. At the dawn of the 20th century, the world's navies were locked in an arms race to see which fleet would dominate the oceans of the world. At the time, battleships ruled the waves. These floating fortresses defined naval power. Yet a new military force was quietly rising. Aviation was upending military doctrine. By 1910, a question came up. What if aircraft could launch from ships? Reconnaissance, long-range bombardment, even torpedo strikes, all seemed within reach if planes could be brought to sea. But there was a problem. Launching a plane from a warship seemed challenging, but feasible. However, landing one was a notion that made pilots laugh in disbelief. That changed on January 18, 1911, in the San Francisco Bay. The armored cruiser USS Pennsylvania sat anchored, its deck transformed into a crude flight platform, 120 feet long, 30 feet wide, bolted above the ship's stern. At its end, ropes stretched across the deck, each tied to sandbags. These would serve as the first ever arresting gear. At the edge of this wooden runway stood Eugene Elley, a former race car mechanic turned exhibition pilot. His aircraft, a Curtiss Model D biplane, looked more like construction scaffolding than an airplane. Elley had already made history 2 months earlier with the first shipboard takeoff, launching from USS Birmingham. That flight nearly ended in disaster, with the plane dipping so low its wheels kissed the water. Now, he was attempting the far harder part, landing. 2 hooks had been rigged to the undercarriage. If everything went according to plan, they'd snag the ropes and bring him to a halt. If not, he'd fly straight into the sea. He took off from nearby Tanforan Field and circled around. A small crowd watched from Pennsylvania's deck. As the biplane approached, the tension was electric. Elley lined up. The tail dipped. Then a gasp and contact. The wheel struck the platform. The hooks dragged. The cables snapped taut, and the plane skidded to a stop, just feet from the edge. He'd done it. Elley climbed out, smiled, and shook the hands of stunned Navy officers. Then he turned the plane around, took off again, and flew back to shore. 3 months later, he lost his life during a stunt flight in Georgia. But what he proved that day on the deck of USS Pennsylvania would ripple through every Navy in the world. The era of the aircraft carrier had begun. The Royal Dare. While American naval aviation had its roots in daring individuals like Eugene Elley across the Atlantic, the British Royal Navy took a more urgent approach. By 1917, the Great War was raging, and the need for ship-launched air support had become critical. The Germans were deploying Zeppelins to bomb Allied cities and scout naval movements. Britain needed a way to fight back, and they needed it fast. The answer was HMS Furious. This old battlecruiser was hastily modified into an experimental aircraft carrier. Her forward gun turret was removed and replaced with a small flight deck. There was no arresting gear and no dedicated landing area, just a flat stretch of timber. It was wartime. It would have to do. On August 2, 1917, Squadron Commander Edwin Dunning became the first pilot in history to land an aircraft on a moving ship. Flying a Sopwith Pup, he circled Furious as she steamed through Scapa Flow. The ship turned into the wind, and Dunning brought the fragile fighter in, timing his descent with near-perfect precision. The wheels touched down. The plane rolled to a stop. No wires, no hooks, just timing, skill, and a bit of luck. But glory quickly turned to tragedy. 5 days later, Dunning attempted the landing again. This time, as he descended in crosswinds, one of his wheels caught the edge of the deck. The Sopwith pup tilted violently, clipped the superstructure, and flipped overboard. Dunning was trapped in the cockpit. He drowned before help could reach him. His loss rocked the Royal Navy, but the mission to bring warplanes into the sea didn't stop. In July 1918, Furious launched a bold raid on the German Zeppelin base at Tondern. 7 Sopwith Camels lifted off her deck and struck deep into enemy territory, but none returned. There was still no system to recover aircraft at sea. Pilots were forced to ditch or land ashore if they survived at all. The British pressed on. By late 1918, they launched HMS Argus, the world's first true aircraft carrier with a full-length flush deck. It had no island, no guns, just an open runway from bow to stern. It was an ugly, slow, and fragile thing, but it worked. Engineering the impossible. Throughout the 1920s, the U.S. Navy faced a daunting question. How do you land heavier, faster aircraft on a moving ship repeatedly without risking the pilot or destroying the plane? They started with the USS Langley, the Navy's first aircraft carrier, commissioned in 1922. A converted coal transport, Langley had no precedent. It looked nothing like modern aircraft carriers, but was a step in the right direction, a floating laboratory, and it needed test pilots. On October 22, 1922, Lieutenant Commander Godfrey Chevalier made history with the first official landing aboard Langley. The landing setting was quite primitive, longitudinal wires running down the deck to guide the wheels, and transverse ropes stretched across, tied to sandbags. It was just a slightly improved version of Ellie's 1911 setup. But Chevalier hit the deck, caught the ropes, and came to a halt. It worked. Barely. Still, crashes were frequent. Some aircraft nosed over. Others bounced, skipped the ropes, and careened into the safety nets, or worse, into the ship's superstructure. Every mistake taught a lesson. Lieutenant Alfred M. Pride, a methodical test pilot with an engineer's mind, was taking notes. At Naval Air Station Hampton Roads, Pride and his team spent months experimenting with wire tension, tailhook angles, and deck layouts. They rigged up spinning platforms to simulate ship motion. They mounted hooks not just on tails, but on axles, fuselages, and anywhere they thought they might help. Eventually, he had a breakthrough. A dedicated tailhook, mounted low and aft on the fuselage, designed to snag a single arresting wire stretched across the deck. Below deck, he devised hydraulic arresting engines, essentially mechanical brakes, that would bring the aircraft to a quick and seamless stop. Instead of relying on sandbags for drag, these new systems could absorb kinetic energy through fluid pressure, stopping aircraft in a smoother, more controlled way. By 1929, the Navy had standardized the system, multiple arresting cables across the deck, each linked to its own hydraulic arrestor engine below. It was messy and loud, but it was transcendental. Crashes and accidents dropped slightly. The technology could be adjusted for different aircraft weights, allowing a wider range of planes to operate at sea. What started as rope and luck was evolving into a science, but perfection was still miles ahead. The paddlemen. By the late 1920s, aircraft could land on carriers, but they still crashed, often. The arresting gear had improved. The tailhook worked. But one thing was missing: guidance, visual cues, real-time corrections. So the Navy turned to its most trusted resource: pilots. On the flight deck of USS Langley, the ship's executive officer, Commander Kenneth Whiting, tried something new. When a rookie pilot struggled to line up for landing, Whiting grabbed 2 white sailor caps, stood on the port side of the deck, and started waving. High, low, cut, power. The plane responded and landed safely. The landing signal officer was born. In the early days, LSOs were improvisers. They used flags, gloves, and even their bare hands to communicate. But the results were undeniable. Pilots flew better when someone coached them in. The role became formalized. Experienced aviators were stationed near the ship's stern on a small platform, able to see the approaching aircraft and signal corrections with paddles. They were called paddles or batsmen, nicknames that stuck for generations. World War II would make them indispensable. Carrier air groups grew by the dozens. Missions stretched thousands of miles across the Pacific. Pilots returned battered, low on fuel, sometimes flying planes riddled with holes. At night or in storms, they often couldn't see the deck until the final seconds. When the cockpit instruments failed, they had one last lifeline, the LSO. Perched just feet from the spinning propellers and arresting wires, they rode out storms, deck pitches, and combat recoveries to bring their fellow aviators home. A skilled LSO could see 1,000 things in a single approach, such as the angle of the nose, the throttle response, and the wind over the deck, and make a snap call. Sometimes they saved a life with a single wave. Cut, they'd signal, telling the pilot to chop power. Wave off when things looked wrong. Come left, add power. Their signals were simple, and they had to be obeyed. Night landings added another level of danger. With no daylight to guide them, LSOs switched to illuminated wands and radio calls. Pilots learned to trust the voice in their ears as much as the instruments in their cockpit. The gear stopped the plane, but the LSOs kept them alive long enough to reach it. Flames in the Pacific. By 1942, aircraft carriers weren't experiments anymore. They were capital ships, floating airfields carrying the war across oceans. The Pacific theater turned them into blunt instruments of destruction. But while the headlines focused on dive bombers and torpedo runs, it was the landings, repeated, relentless, and unforgiving, that tested the nerves of every naval aviator. On board carriers like USS Enterprise, Yorktown, and Lexington, the tempo was brutal. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day, striking enemy fleets, ground targets, or intercepting bombers. But the most dangerous part of the mission wasn't the flak. It was coming home. Each approach was made at full throttle. If the tailhook missed the arresting wire, a bolter, the pilot had split seconds to gun the engine and take off again before running out of deck. Too slow, and they didn't make it. Too fast, and they crashed through the barrier. The pressure was constant. The Navy used wire barricades to catch failed landings. A misjudged approach could shear wings, split fuselages, or ignite fuel lines. Flight decks turned into battlegrounds of their own as servicemen struggled to keep warplanes from crashing, running into each other, or ramming against landed planes. Kamikazes turned that chaos into overdrive. In late 1944, these Japanese pilots began targeting U.S. carriers during the day. The need for round-the-clock combat air patrols meant night landings became unavoidable. The Navy rushed to train dedicated night squadrons. With Hellcats and Avengers equipped with radar, these aviators returned in total darkness to blacked-out decks, guided only by radio, dim blue lights, and a glowing LSO wand. Pilots called it the most terrifying thing in the war. One said it was, quote, like trying to land on a postage stamp. Yet they did it, again and again. The Royal Navy faced its own trials. Their carriers, like HMS Illustrious, braved kamikaze strikes with armored decks that withstood punishment better than American carriers, but at the cost of aircraft capacity. Every design choice was a trade-off. World War II proved that carriers could dominate global warfare, but it was the men who landed on them who paid the price to prove it. Jet jitters. The war had ended with the carriers triumphant, but victory carried a new problem: speed. By 1945, jet aircraft were here, bringing new dangers for flat-tops. Propeller planes like the Hellcat landed at 85 knots. The first jets did so at over 120 knots. Heavier, faster, and far less forgiving. They didn't spool up quickly. They didn't handle well at low speeds, and they didn't crash safely. The Navy learned this the hard way. Early jet operations on straight-deck carriers were carnage. Pilots missed wires. Planes skipped over arresting gear or slammed into parked aircraft. On board, safety nets and barriers struggled to keep up. Even the best landing signal officers couldn't save everyone. Some just didn't have enough margin for error. But while America struggled, the British pressed forward. Enter Captain Eric Winkle Brown, a Royal Navy test pilot with more carrier landings than any man alive. On December 3, 1945, Brown made history when he landed the de Havilland Vampire jet on HMS Ocean. No one had done it before, and many believed it wasn't possible. But even he knew the system needed to evolve. He nearly lost his life when the jet's nose pitched up on touchdown. He told the engineers, quote, "We need more deck, and we need margin for mistakes." In 1952, Royal Navy engineer Louis Boddington and Captain Dennis Campbell proposed a revolutionary concept: rotate the landing area 8 degrees off the center line. If a plane missed the wires, it wouldn't hit the barricade. It could just throttle up and go around. It also allowed simultaneous launch and recovery operations. That year, trials began on HMS Triumph, with lines painted diagonally on the deck. Then, the U.S. Navy took it further, modifying USS Antietam with an actual angled steel extension. In 1953, she conducted full arrested landings. The improvement was immediate. Accidents dropped. Bolters became routine, not deadly. This helped the jet age reach the sea. From that point forward, the flight deck wasn't just longer, it was smarter. The ball and the hook. In the mid-1950s, jet aircraft were landing safely on angled decks. But safely wasn't the same as accurately. Carrier landings still relied heavily on human judgment. Landing signal officers stood just feet from danger, using radios and hand signals to guide pilots in. But as jets grew faster, with narrower margins and higher sink rates, that judgment wasn't always enough. The Navy needed something better, something the pilot could read directly as he or she approached. The solution, again, came from the Royal Navy. In 1951, British Commander Nick Goodhart developed the mirror landing aid. Mounted on the port side of the flight deck, it featured a gyroscopically stabilized concave mirror and a series of colored lights. When pilots approached the ship, they'd see a glowing orange ball reflected in the mirror, floating against a row of horizontal green datum lights. If the ball was in line with the greens, the pilot was on glide slope. Too high, and the ball floated above. Too low, and it dropped, eventually glowing red. Unlike paddles or hand signals, this gave real-time visual feedback straight into the pilot's eyes. In trials aboard HMS Illustrious, the system performed flawlessly. By 1955, the U.S. Navy had adopted it. And just like that, a new phrase entered the carrier pilot's vocabulary: call the ball. The mirror evolved. First came brighter lamps, then came lenses. By the 1960s, the Fresnel Lens Optical Landing System, or FLOLS, replaced the mirror altogether, using a lens array to project the light ball more clearly and consistently. It worked in bad weather, bright sunlight, and rough seas. Later versions, like the iFLOLS or improved Fresnel lens system, refined it even further. Now, pilots flew with the ball, not just the LSO's voice. They scanned 3 things: the ball, lineup, and angle of attack. Those 3 controlled every move in the groove. LSOs didn't go away. They became watchers, ready to wave off an aircraft if it deviated too far. Their role evolved into a safety net and backup, no longer the sole authority, but still vital. But no matter how perfect the approach was, it only counted if the wires stopped the jet. Controlled crashes. On a modern U.S. Navy supercarrier, the landing area is about 500 feet long. The jet is closing in at over 130 miles per hour. There's no flare, no soft touchdown. The pilot holds glide slope, slams onto the deck, and hopes the tailhook catches. It's violent by design. Some pilots call it a controlled crash. It begins with a call, quote, Hornet 205, ball 3.1. That means the jet is in the groove, about 3/4 of a mile behind the carrier, with a fuel state of 3.1 thousand pounds. The pilot sees the meatball, the glowing light from the Fresnel lens optical system, and lines it up with the green datum lights. Now, everything happens fast. The throttle controls the glide slope. Pitch is held steady. If the ball is low, add power. If it's high, back off. All while correcting for crosswind, ship motion, and turbulence kicked up by the island. The pilot keeps an eye on 3 things: ball, lineup, and angle of attack. There's no room for guessing. The deck might pitch 6 or 10 feet at a time in rough seas. And behind the pilot's calm voice is a mind doing dozens of real-time calculations. Beneath the deck, the arresting gear crew stands ready. They've dialed in the Mark 7 engine to the weight of the incoming aircraft. If the hook grabs a wire, it unspools a steel cable linked to hydraulic pistons, which is designed to stop the aircraft in under 2 seconds. On touchdown, the pilot does something counterintuitive. They slam the throttles forward. This unthinkable action is in case they miss the wire. The bolter means the jet has to get airborne immediately. There's no time to spool up after the fact. If the hook hits, bam. The jet goes from 130 to 0 in 320 feet. A 20-ton machine is stopped by 3 inches of steel cable and 70-year-old physics. A pilot's body slams forward into the harness. Their teeth rattle. Fuel sloshes. Behind the pilot, the landing signal officer watches every move. They have override lights. Wave off if things go south. The moment the jet stops, the hook is raised, the wire drops, and the deck crew swarms in. 30 seconds later, the next one is inbound. It's choreography and split-second engineering. Hidden toll. No matter how much the technology has evolved, carrier landings continue to be dangerous and brutally punishing. On March 18, 2016, a routine landing aboard the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower turned into a near-fatal disaster. An E-2C Hawkeye from Carrier Airborne Early Warning Squadron 123 attempted to land using one of the ship's arresting cables. But as the Hawkeye caught the cable, it snapped free from its mooring, failing to arrest the aircraft's momentum. The plane continued at high speed, careening off the end of the flight deck and briefly disappearing from view. Miraculously, the pilots managed to regain control and return safely to Naval Station Norfolk. But behind them, the recoiling cable had lashed across the deck with tremendous force, striking 8 sailors. Injuries ranged from broken limbs and dislocated hips to a fractured skull, and an injury that nearly led to an amputation. 4 sailors were airlifted off the ship for emergency treatment. The incident marked the first time in over a decade that an arresting cable had snapped during a carrier landing, prompting a full investigation. Though Eisenhower resumed flight operations within days, the psychological toll remained. Eyewitnesses described the horror of watching the aircraft plunge off the bow and the aftermath of injured crewmates sprawled across the deck. While all injured sailors survived, some faced long-term recovery and medical retirement. The arresting gear was a breakthrough that had saved countless lives, but it too could fail. Even when the gear works as intended and stops the aircraft safely, the force of the airmen's bodies is enough to wreck a car crash dummy. 0 to 150 miles per hour in a few seconds on launch, 150 to 0 in under 2 seconds on recovery. Over and over, for years. In 2024, rumors inside the Navy turned into alarm bells. Several veteran pilots, and Top Gun instructors no less, began showing strange symptoms. Memory loss, mood swings, insomnia, depression. Some took their own lives. Families were left stunned, and the Navy was forced to ask itself whether it was unknowingly breaking its best pilots. The Navy launched a classified medical inquiry known as Project Odin's Eye. Its focus, with a repeated exposure to carrier takeoffs, landings, and high-G maneuvers, was causing cumulative brain trauma, similar to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, in NFL players. It wasn't hard to imagine. Each catapult shot slams the brain backward. Each arrested landing slams it forward. Microscopic trauma, repeated hundreds of times over a career. Dr. Kristen Barnes, a former F-14 pilot turned neurologist, put it bluntly, quote, "You go from 0 to 200 in under 3 seconds. Your brain doesn't have time to catch up. Multiply that by 750 traps, and you start to see things come apart." MRI scans showed subtle abnormalities, not in every pilot, but enough to worry. And yet, no one wanted to talk about it. Pilots feared grounding. Flight status is everything. Admitting symptoms meant losing the right to fly. So most stayed quiet, until they couldn't. In 2025, Congress launched a formal inquiry. Emails were leaked, and families testified. One pilot's widow said her husband, quote, could navigate 15 feet of deck at night in a storm, but couldn't remember their son's name 2 years later. The Navy promised reforms, more screening, and more post-deployment checkups. Quiet talks began about redesigning helmets, limiting total career traps, and even softening catapult launches. The new Ford-class carriers, with electromagnetic catapults and advanced arresting gear, may help. Their smoother profiles could reduce the impact. But for now, the truth is sobering. Behind every perfect landing lies a hidden cost, borne not by the jet, but by the brain inside it. The future. The damage traps leave on pilots is yet another reason for carrier landing technology to continue to evolve. Soon, lives might not be at risk. In 2013, a bat-winged aircraft with no pilot in the cockpit approached the carrier USS George H.W. Bush. It wasn't a test flight. It was a test landing. The X-47B was a fully autonomous drone. No human hand on the stick. No eyes in the cockpit. Just a string of code, a data link, and a flight control algorithm make hundreds of adjustments per second. It hits the deck clean. Hook down. Wire caught. Arrested stop. The crowd on the flight deck didn't cheer. They stared. They knew what it meant. The next revolution had landed. Today, the Navy is already training with MQ-25 Stingrays, unmanned aerial tankers built for carrier ops. These drones fly patterns, take gas, give gas, and land autonomously. Human pilots are still overseeing, but AI will soon call the ball. As for manned aircraft, the machines are already in the cockpit. The FA-18EF Super Hornets and F-35Cs now use precision landing mode, a digital assist system known as Magic Carpet. With it, pilots don't fight throttle and pitch like they used to. They guide the jet with fingertip inputs. The computer adjusts everything else, such as flaps, trim, and glide slope. The jet flies like it's on rails. The results are fewer bolters, tighter wire hits, less fatigue, and more mental bandwidth for the pilot. Then there's JPALS, or the Joint Precision Approach and Landing System. It's GPS-based, encrypted, accurate to within centimeters. It tells the jet exactly where the deck is, even in a storm. Combine it with autopilot, and you get something Ellie never dreamed of: hands-free carrier landings in zero visibility. The Royal Navy has gone its own way. On board HMS Queen Elizabeth, F-35Bs use rolling vertical landings, a hybrid of jet lift and forward motion. No arresting wires, no catapults, just software, training, and power. An entirely different solution to the same problem. But whether it's a drone or a stealth fighter, every landing still carries the ghost of that first one. Back in 1911, Eugene Ellie stood on a wooden platform bolted to a cruiser without light systems or guides, just ropes, sandbags, and a homemade hook. He landed anyway and changed the history of aviation and warfare forever.